Hola a todos y bienvenidos al MOOC, Curso Básico de Lengua y Cultura Españolas, Nivel 2. Welcome to the Basic Spanish Language and Culture Course, Level 2. Soy Vijaya Venkataraman, soy tu profesora de español para este curso online. En este video vamos a hablar de las escritoras más reconocidas, muchas veces excluidas del canon literario de América Latina. Vamos a enfocarnos más en el siglo XIX y el XX. Al final también mencionaremos a algunas escritoras del siglo XXI. In this video, you will learn about Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, a voice rescued from oblivion, important aspects of the lives and works of women writers of the 19th and the 20th century, and we will mention some young voices from the 21st century. During the colonial period, women were absent from the literary canon as their writing was not considered literally worthy of being included. However, the one name that has been rescued from oblivion is that of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz was born in 1648 and died relatively young at the age of 47 in 1695. She was a Mexican writer, philosopher, composer and poet of the Baroque period and a Hieronymite nun. Beginning her studies at a young age, Sor Juana was fluent in Latin and also wrote in Nahuatl and became known for her philosophy in her teens. Sor Juana educated herself in her own library, which was mostly inherited from her grandfather. She chose to become a nun so that she could study as she wished, since she wanted to have no fixed occupation which would curtail her freedom to study. She joined a nunnery in 1667 to escape marriage and began writing poetry and prose dealing with topics such as love, environmentalism, feminism, and religion. She was condemned by the higher church officials for her criticism of misogyny and the hypocrisy of men, and in 1694 she was forced to sell her collection of books and focus on charity towards the poor. Her work faded from literary and academic discourse and she was rediscovered only in the 20th century. One of her most famous works is the reply to Sister Philothea, in which she defended women's right to formal education. By putting women, specifically older women, in positions of authority, Sor Juana argued women could educate other women. Her literary contributions through her poetry and essays gained her the epithet of the 10th Muse or the Phoenix of America. Now we will go to the 19th century. The dominant idea that persisted amongst the public intellectuals of the 19th century were that of feminine irrationality and dependence. Women were entered partial entry into the literary cliques of letrados as upholders of a generally conservative order, which might be of Republican or liberal persuasion. To challenge this state of affairs, it was crucial that women should sign, publish, and claim authorship of their own writings, irrespective of political persuasion, means of publication, or genre. That means they could write poetry, essays, novels, articles, school books, histories, and memoirs. By publishing, women reminded the self-appointed producers of public culture that women too were culturally productive. Women's intervention changed the shape of public culture in that it had to acknowledge and respond to their presence. However, very often their writing tended not to be radical, with few exceptions. Yet, the very fact that they published at all and in increasing numbers, thus contributing to public culture in their own right and in their own name, was very significant. Their literary discourse was markedly different from that of men. Unlike the romantic men, they did not idealize or demonize the feminine. Women writers of the immediate post-independence period could be put into two broad categories: those who stayed within the boundaries marked for women. Those who stayed within the boundaries marked for women were Josefa Acevedo and Mercedes Marin. Both these writers went largely unrecognized, also because they decided to accept social norms and behave in accordance to them in order for their writing to be accepted. They advocated obtaining respect and status through love and obedience to family values. They wrote poetry, patriotic poetry, and their poetry reached the audience through publication in newspapers or pamphlets, or sometimes through recitals in public and semi-public events. But the most common means of dissemination was through the institution and network that was by far the most significant and empowering for elite Creole women at the time, that is, the extended family, friends and relations, kith and kin. Mercedes Marin was the first recognized woman writer of independent Chile. Her first 2 sonnets were published anonymously, and she wrote some 100 poems, including 50 sonnets, virtually all poemas de ocasión as they were known, to mark an event, a birthday, a funeral, an anniversary, etc. of family and friends. Joseba Acevedo de Gomez, unlike Marin's poetry, her poetry is personal, lyrical and subjective, voicing her inmost thoughts and anxieties. Acevedo also published, among other works, short biographies of her father, brothers and husband, all published as pamphlets. Now we come to those who rebelled against prevalent gender norms and faced ostracization. The most important one was Juana Manuela Gorriti, who was an Argentinian writer with extensive political and literary links to Bolivia and Peru. In Lima, she developed a name as an influential journalist and started to host tertulias on a regular basis. Tertulias or salons would be attended by the fashionable and mostly well-educated men and women who would meet to discuss literature and social progress, themes that Gorriti felt passionate about and would include in much of her literature. By organizing and hosting such tertulias, Gorriti provided a great opportunity for female writers to come together and discuss literature, progress, and the progress of women. She was an ardent feminist before the term itself was invented, and her dedication to women's rights showed in many of her journals. Another writer of this category was Juana Paula Manso, was one such writer who was interested in women's education not only to ensure literacy but to contest the ideological effects of education, mainly through the Catholic Church. She talked about citizenship for women. Though slavery was being abolished around this time in Latin America, women did not receive the same consideration. She was the first female feminist intellectual of the River Plate provinces. Her liberal feminism tended to minimize the significance of sexual difference. In her view, women were autonomous individuals and moral agents, as deserving of citizenship as men, and citizenship would entail their participation in the polity as social and historical beings, and modernity was predicated on the education and liberation of all women into public life. Her feminist credo is spelled out clearly in her journalism in the journal she founded called Album de Señoritas. Unlike Acevedo and Marin, during her lifetime, Juana Manso did not command social respect in her homeland. Her outspoken views contesting prevailing gender and religious norms gained her very few friends. She was publicly derided in Argentina, and her literary work was largely dismissed as irrelevant. Now we come to the writers of the 20th century, and we'll go country-wise in this. First, we'll start with the Argentinian women writers of the 20th century, and the first writer we'd like to mention is Alfonsina Storni, who was born in 1892 and died in 1938. She was an Argentinian poet and playwright of the modernist period. Storni was among the first women to find success in the male-dominated areas of literature and theatre in Argentina, and as such developed into a unique and valuable voice that holds particular relevance in Latin American poetry. Storni often gave controversial opinions. She criticized a wide range of topics, from politics to gender roles and discrimination against women. In Storni's time, her work did not align itself with a particular movement or genre. The next writer we'll talk about is Victoria Ocampo, who was born in 1890 and died in 1979. She was best known as an advocate for others and as a publisher of the literary magazine Sur. She was also a writer and critic in her own right and one of the most prominent South American women of her time. Silvina Ocampo, born in 1903 and died in 1993, was an Argentinian short story writer, poet and artist. Ocampo's friend and collaborator Jorge Luis Borges called her one of the greatest poets in the Spanish language, whether on this side of the ocean or the other. Now we come to Luisa Valenzuela, born in 1938, who's a post-boom novelist and short story writer. Her writing is characterized by an experimental style which questions hierarchical social structures from a feminist perspective. She is best known for her work written in response to the dictatorship of the 1970s in Argentina. Works such as Como en la Guerra, Cambio de Armas, and Cola de Lagartija combine a powerful critique of dictatorship with an examination of patriarchal forms of social organization and the power structures which inhere in human sexuality and gender relationships. Now we come to Chile, and the first writer who is known by her pseudonym as Gabriela Mistral, born in 1889 and died in 1957, was a Chilean poet, diplomat, educator and humanist, and in 1945 she became the first Latin American author to receive a Nobel Prize in Literature, and for her lyric poetry, which inspired by powerful emotions had made her name a symbol of the idealistic inspirations of the entire Latin American world. Central themes in her poems are nature, betrayal, love, mother's love, sorrow and recovery, Latin American identity as formed from a mixture of Native American and European influences. The other writer, Maria Luisa Bombal, born in 1910 and died in 1980, had her early education in Paris, after which she returned to Chile, where she reunited with her family. Her work incorporates erotic, surrealist and feminist themes. Bombal wrote distinctly for her female and male characters, and she viewed femininity as a symbol of uniqueness, more related to nature, emotions and intuition, very different from how she depicts masculinity. Men are described as stronger and wiser at the moment of facing problems. Some of her works are El Árbol, La Última Niebla, La Amortajada. One of the most well-known names from Chile is, of course, Isabel Allende, born in 1942, and sometimes her work has been described as containing aspects of magical realism in her novels such as The House of Spirits, La Casa de los Espíritus, and City of the Beast, La Ciudad de las Bestias, which have been commercially successful. Allende has been called the world's most widely read Spanish language author. Allende's novels are often based upon her personal experiences and historical events and pay homage to the lives of women while weaving together elements of myth and realism. Her novels have been translated into more than 40 languages and sold about 74 million copies. Latino Leaders magazine called her a literary legend in a 2007 article, naming her the third most influential Latino leader in the world. The last writer from Chile that we will deal with is Diamela Eltit, who wrote at a time in the 1980s, which was a complicated period for Chilean intellectuals who had to elaborate strategies to publish and circulate their works in a cultural environment where censorship existed. Women's publications were a significant contribution in this period because they generated renewed spaces of thinking on political issues and subjects such as sexuality, authoritarianism, domestic life, and gender identity were incorporated. Eltit was part of this new generation and not only articulated an original literary project a theoretical, aesthetic, social, and political proposal with a new reading space as perspective. Now we will move to women writers from Central America and Cuba. Julia de Burgos was a Puerto Rican poet. She was born in 1914 and died in 1953. As an advocate of Puerto Rican independence, she served as Secretary General of the Daughters of Freedom. She was also a civil rights activist for women and African Afro-Caribbean writers. By the early 30s, Burgos was already an published writer in journals and newspapers. She published 3 books which contained a collection of her poems. Her lyrical poems are a combination of the intimate, the land, the social struggle of the oppressed. Many critics assert that her poetry anticipated the work of feminist writers and poets as well as that of other Hispanic authors. In one of her poems she writes, "I am life, strength, woman." Rosario Ferre de Arellano was a Puerto Rican writer, poet and essayist. She came from a family that was involved with the Puerto Rican struggle for independence. In 1976, she published her first collection of short stories, Papeles de Pandora. In 1977, she published a collection of her literary essays which promoted political and social themes. And in 1986, she published her first book, Maldito Amor, which she self-translated into English as Sweet Diamond Dust. Ferre also worked as a professor at the University of Puerto Rico and was a contributing editor for the San Juan Star, which was Puerto Rico's English language newspaper. From Nicaragua, we have a writer, Gioconda Belli, born in 1948, who is an author, novelist and poet. In 1970, Belli published her first poems in the literary supplement of the Nicaraguan newspaper La Prensa. 2 years later, she won the Premio de Poesía from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Nicaragua. From 1970, when she began writing her poems, and like many other intellectuals of her generation, she joined the ranks of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, the FASALN, at a time when a clandestine and persecuted organization whose aim was to overthrow the Somoza regime. She was a clandestine courier, transported weapons, traveled across Europe and Latin America, obtaining resources and spreading the word about the Sandinista struggle. She became a member of the FSLN's Political Diplomatic Commission after the overthrow of the dictator. Belli's book, La Mujer Habitada, published in 1988, is considered a feminist manifesto of sorts and is a semi-autobiographical novel that raised gender issues for the first time in the Nicaraguan revolutionary narratives. Nancy Morejon, born in 1944, is a Cuban poet, critic and essayist. She was a recipient of the Struga Poetry Evening's Golden Wreath Award. She is the best known and most widely translated woman poet of post-revolutionary Cuba. In 1982, she was awarded the Cuban Premio de la Crítica for Piedra Pulida, and in 2001, she won Cuba's National Prize for Literature, awarded for the first time to a black woman. Her work explores a range of themes: the mythology of the Cuban nation, the relationship of the black people of Cuba within Cuba, and she often expresses an integrationist stand in which Spanish and African cultures fuse to make a new Cuban identity. Much of her work locates her as a supporter of the Cuban Revolution. In addition, she also voices the situation of women within her society, expressing concern for women's experience and for racial equality. Her most notable poem is Mujer Negra, Black Woman, which treats the grievous fact of slavery as an ancestral experience. Women writers from Mexico that merit mention are Rosario Castellanos, who is one of Mexico's most important literary voices in the last century. Throughout her life, she wrote eloquently about issues of culture and gender oppression, and her work has influenced Mexican feminist theory and cultural studies. Though she died young, she opened the door of Mexican literature to women and left a legacy that still resonates today. Laura Esquivel, born in 1950, is another Mexican novelist. She's a screenwriter and politician as well. And in her novel Like Water for Chocolate, released in 1989, Esquivel uses magical realism to combine the ordinary and the supernatural, with narrative devices similar to those used by Gabriel Garcia Marquez and the Chilean author Isabel Allende, that is magical realism. Como Agua para Chocolate is set during the Mexican Revolution of the early 20th century and features the importance of the kitchen and food in the life of its female protagonist, Tita. Ángeles Mastretta, 1949, is a post-boom Mexican author, journalist, actress and film producer. She is well known for creating inspirational female characters and fictional pieces that reflect the social and political realities of Mexico. She is a recipient of the Romulo Gallegos Prize and the Mazatlan Prize for Literature for Best Book. Her book, Arráncame la Vida, Tear This Heart Out, was adapted into a movie which won an Ariel Award in Mexico. Mastretta highlights the freedom that writing provides women and how feminism can only be fostered in specific environments out of reach from social pressures. She emphasizes the idea that feminism is something instinctive for women and that society is what makes it difficult to further develop. Elena Poniatowska is a French-born Mexican journalist and author, specializing in works on social and political issues focused on those considered to be disenfranchised, especially the women and the poor. Despite the lack of opportunities for women from the 50s to the 70s, she wrote about social and political issues in newspapers, both in fiction and non-fiction forms. Chicana and Latina writers. We will mention two writers only for shortage of time. Gloria Ansaldúa, born in 1942, is a scholar of Chicana cultural theory, feminist theory and queer theory. She loosely based her best-known book, Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza, on her life growing up on the Mexico-Texas border and incorporated her lifelong experience of social and cultural marginalization into her work. She also developed theories about the marginal, in-between and mixed cultures that develop along the borders. Julia Alvarez, born in 1950, is from the Dominican Republic but lives in the US. She writes in English and is one of the best-known Latina voices today. Many of Alvarez's works are influenced by her experiences as a Dominican American and focus heavily on issues of immigration, assimilation and identity. She is known for works that examine cultural expectations of women both in the Dominican Republic and the United States and for rigorous investigations of cultural stereotyping. Since we are almost at the end of the video, it will not be possible to go into the details of the new voices. I will just mention a few which you can look up if you are interested. Lina Meruane and Alejandra Costamagna, both from Chile, Fernanda Melchor and Valeria Luiselli from Mexico, Samantha Schweblin and Gabriela Cabezon Cámara from Argentina, Ana Lucia Portela from Cuba, Piedad Bonet from Colombia. And with that, we come to the end of the video, and I would urge you to read some of these writers, especially Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz and her response to Sor Filotea, and also you could read Octavio Paz's book on her, Sor Juana o las Trampas de la Fe, which has been also translated into English. You could also read Gioconda Belli's La Mujer Habitada, which is considered a kind of a manifesto of Latin American feminism. Thank you very much for your